This is Michael Glickman of Gold Coast Arts, home to Long Island's most vibrant arts center and international film festival. And it's my pleasure to welcome an online audience to our Cultural Insider series. We're joined by Andrew Goldberg, the Emmy Award-winning investigative producer and director, who has executive produced and directed 13 primetime documentary specials for PBS and public television, 2 broadcast series, and countless segments for various media outlets across the spectrum. Some of Andrew's notable films include The Armenian Genocide, Jerusalem, Center of the World, They Came to America, Proud to Serve, The Men and Women of the U.S. Army, hosted by Walter Cronkite, and the list goes on. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Let's talk about your latest film, Viral, Antisemitism and Four Mutations, which premieres on PBS on May 26. The film has been described as powerful, eye-opening, suggested as required viewing for social studies, government, and history classes around the world, frightening and moving, brutal yet vital, must-see viewing. Talk to us about why you made the film and why now.
Well, I think that you can never have too many films about any of the ills of the world. I think that, you know, society is woefully uninformed, and anti-Semitism is something that is one of any number of sort of causes I could have chosen. Obviously, it's having the name Goldberg, it's a little closer to me, but I do come to this really as a journalist, not as someone who's sort of pursuing my own Jewish concerns. That being said, after the election, we started to see more and more anecdotal evidence that anti-Semitism was on the rise, and that was followed by more and more studies and statistics and data and journalist and coverage in the press about anti-Semitic incidents that were happening and about trends that we saw where things were only getting worse. And then we, of course, saw some very high-profile anti-Semitic things. There was the threats of a James Earl Ray style march in Whitefish, Montana, against a Jewish woman. Then ultimately we saw Charlottesville, where they were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." And these are just some of the more high-profile examples that are visible. But what you don't see is that people are taking their kids out of schools, and you're seeing swastikas being drawn on places, and there are rumblings from the administration that are making people concerned, and so once you sort of blow the sewer covers off of this stuff and it starts to come out, those are very hard to put back on again. And I wish I could take credit for that analogy. I can't. It comes from Pamela Nadell at American University. But that is sort of where we are, and it was concerning enough to me that we needed to start a film. Excuse me for rubbing my eye.
So, what do you hope that Viral will teach viewers about today's political climate?
Well, I mean, teaching them about the political climate would be sort of a secondary interest of mine, as to people just knowing what's going on in terms of anti-Semitism. Because while anti-Semitism is connected to politics, anti-Semitism isn't, and while anti-Semitism is often an expression that is political, I think it's more important that people get out of what I would call their ignorance about the issue. People just aren't aware of anti-Semitism. They assume that there was the Holocaust and then it ended. Or there was one mistake, which was Charlottesville, but otherwise anti-Semitism isn't a problem. And it's very easy to make that assumption when you, certainly in the United States, when your most visible Jewish people are fairly well off and seem like they're part of a trend of success. And so you look at, Jerry Seinfeld, and you look at Larry David, and you look at the president of, former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Now, whether or not people particularly like any of these people is secondary to the fact that people see them as people who are doing just fine. And so the idea that there's anti-Semitism in the world, in the United States, seems almost as if it's wealthy people complaining. Never mind that there are, millions of Jews in this country who are not Jerry Seinfeld. There are impoverished Jews. There are Jews of color. There are Jews who are maybe have a Hispanic background who are getting it from both sides. They're getting anti-Hispanic bigotry, and they're getting anti-Semitic bigotry. And so to interpret the Jews through the lens of look at these successful people on TV or whatever is wrong. But that's what people believe. And so we want to show people that anti-Semitism hits everyone. And also that anti-Semitism is usually a precursor to all the other hates in the world, right? So you see anti-Semitism first, and then you see all the other bigotries and ills of society start to accelerate. It's like the canary in the coal mine.
When did you start working on the film?
We started on the film right at the very beginning of 2017, January, February or so. So it was about a 3-year effort. And it was pretty intense and nonstop. And in fact, Pittsburgh, the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue happened when we were well into the production. We were hoping to wrap it up, and suddenly, you know, that happened. And then, you know, ultimately, then later in Southern California happened, where they shot a woman and shot the rabbi in the hand. And we had to rewrite our whole schedule, and we were finally done in early 2020 this year. To January or so. In fact, today PBS sent us a note that we needed a little tweak. So we're technically still fixing it, although it's been delivered and submitted and it's out the door.
So a well-regarded scholar that you interviewed in the film said, and I quote, "We're in a terrifying moment. Anti-Semitism is coming at Jews around the world, from the left and right, from the government and from the ground up." Couple that with another interviewee who said it's going to get worse before it gets better, which to me means that your film spotlights a problem that is both timeless and terrifying. Can you offer some context about what the viewer could expect when they view this?
Look, I wish I was more optimistic about the future. I'm not one of these, and keep in mind, you know, I was a reporter on this film. I wasn't an analyst. This isn't an op-ed piece. You don't ever hear me as a narrator or someone in the film ever once saying, it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. I just couldn't find anybody that didn't feel that way. I mean, I'm sure there are people that do, you know, but that being said, you know, the pessimism that I have is that historically we see these situations repeat themselves. And I think that, you know, one of the greatest mute buttons, or you push mute and it turns off whatever you're listening to. One of the greatest mute buttons for anti-Semitism was the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened, it's this tragic event, and then suddenly Europe is on good behavior. Germany is giving reparations, Austria is helping with the claims of finding lost art that was seized from Jews. Germany is outlawed the Nazi Party, they're creating educational programs, and this you see happening throughout Europe, where Europe suddenly has no tolerance for anti-Semitism. That's not to say that they really have no tolerance for it, because everybody knows that anti-Semitism has just sort of gone underground, just like racism has. But over time, you see statistics, education studies, attitude studies, all working. Anti-Semitism is reducing. As the people who were in the Holocaust and the people who witnessed the Holocaust and the people who were in the Second World War die off or become so old that they're not participating in public life the way they used to, the voices of reason that we learned from the Holocaust are gone. They're gone. So what you have now is a new generation of people who can look at Jews without anybody telling them that they're looking at Jews the wrong way. If you were in Europe and if you were in Germany, you started to rattle off the idea that the Jews are behind the economy. In Germany, let's say in the 80s, somebody would have said to you, that's not how we talk here. Well, those people are fading away, tragically. And so when someone points, for example, to Israel and refers to Israel as a bunch of Nazis, they don't realize how offensive that is, because the Holocaust will always be with Jews. And so these voices all come back again. And so my pessimism, I think, is in large part because the cycle of reason. Those who understand our reasonable about things, they go away, and then the bad attitudes come back. I hope my answers aren't too long for you.
No, I think this is great. And I think it's going to help offer some level of perspective. You mentioned Pittsburgh, but in the film, you travel to and you feature Pittsburgh, London, Budapest, and Paris. Can you talk a bit about what all of those cities have in common?
Well, they're all cities. I mean, I think, and I think that, perhaps it would have been interesting for us to spend more time in rural areas. The but and in cities you generally get a more open-minded, liberal-minded thinking. That being said, um, people hate Jews, and they hate Jews for a number of reasons, but they tend to come back to very similar themes with that Jews are out to hurt us, Jews are conspiring against us, Jews are part of some insider community that either the larger community has let the Jews in, or the Jews are controlling the larger community. For example, people say that various Jews are controlling the U.S. government, right? That George Soros, a Jewish billionaire, who isn't even particularly observant or concerned with his own Judaism, but still is Jewish, is somehow behind the American president or behind the Hungarian immigration so-called problem that they have. And this is something that all these people share in common, is that they need to stop the Jews. If you look at other bigotries, every bigotry has its own flavor. With Jews, it's we need to stop them because they're out to hurt us, right? If you look at racism toward LGBTQI people, if you look at not racism, bigotry, if you look at bigotry toward Hispanic people or toward African Americans, you see a different flavor and a different style for each one. And this is also why each one of these needs to be handled in a very specific way. One of the things we see today is all these groups that are of sideline communities, disenfranchised communities, merging together, what people are calling intersectionality, where they collectively say we will not tolerate hate anymore. But that doesn't do anything, because it just creates a community of people saying they care. Each one of these bigotries needs to be handled in its own specific way. You can't do that as a group. You can't. It's like a grocery store that sells everything. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Someone's not going to come to buy everything. They're going to come to buy, broccoli.
So I imagine if you were working on the film now, you would include something on this particular moment and how this global pandemic is spreading hate beyond the pale. ADL just announced that this past year recorded the largest number in incidents since they started tracking 40 years ago. From your perspective, what else has changed since you completed the film?
Well, I mean, anti-Semitism is sort of an evolving. It changes day to day. I mean, what's changed? I don't know that much has changed. I mean, obviously, people are at home now, so violent acts are down in terms of crime. I can only assume that means that violent acts are down in terms of physical anti-Semitic incidents. Children being beaten, children being teased or harassed. In France and in the United States, parents are taking out of schools because they don't want what they're exposed to. Private schools are tolerant of that. But what I do think is interesting is that coronavirus is now being blamed for it. Jews are being blamed for it. They've called it the Jew flu. There are people who say that it's been unleashed to control the Western powers. They've said that this is mostly online, right? They've said that Jews have been working with China, and that once again, a lot of people are blaming the Zionists, whatever that means for this. Maybe they refer to the government of Israel, or it's never quite clear who they're talking about. But and I think that's a very interesting thing. Or does your question have more to do with the idea of a virus as my theme and the virus itself? Because I could speak to that as well, if you'd like.
Well, why don't you? I think that would be a helpful analogy.
Well, I mean, a virus, as we know, it spreads from person to person. And the idea of anti-Semitism as a virus is that it spreads from person to person and infects the recipient. Now, you can't wear a mask to stop anti-Semitism, but so anti-Semitism can go anytime anybody talks or writes, they can infect others with anti-Semitism. At the same time, coronavirus doesn't spread over the internet. At least we don't think so. So, but I will say this, and it's very important to understand this: anti-Semites are malicious, are fear-based, are hateful, are motivated by a lot of personal concerns. Some imagined, many imagined, some real, but incorrectly ascribed to Jews. Coronavirus is not malicious. viruses are not malicious, and it's unfair in a sense, perhaps unfair of me, to ascribe the general nasty, unpleasant, negative nature of anti-Semitism onto a virus, because a virus is no different from a human. It's just trying to survive. I mean, people have described humans as viruses on this planet because we're simply trying to survive. A human doesn't eat a pig because he's angry at the pig or wants to. Well, Jews maybe don't eat the pig, but a human doesn't eat a whatever they don't eat a fish because they want to kill that fish, right? They're trying to survive. A coronavirus isn't getting inside your body because it's mad at you. It's simply trying to survive. Anti-Semites are not trying to survive. They seek to harm. And this is a very important difference to differentiate biology from human behavior that is driven with these negative impulses. And in that regard, I have more respect for coronavirus than I do for anti-Semites, even though you know, you could argue that in contemporary times, coronavirus is probably killing more Jews than anti-Semitism is. Certainly not historically. Although if you get into all the other viruses over the years, they've probably killed far more Jews than any anti-Semitism in the past. But that is a much bigger philosophical question I'm not going to get into.
What surprised you most about making the film while you were making the film?
Well, I mean, I learned stuff. I didn't realize just how deep it was in France. You know, when I showed it to a couple of our advisors, he was like, "Wow, you know, a guy, one of them who knows a lot about anti-Semitism. All of our advisors know a lot, but he was like, I've never seen France so close up." Another thing that surprises me is how many people are know-it-alls when they come to watching a film like this, because you simply, you know, there's no way that even, you know, the president of the Anti-Defamation League is going to know, or the president of no one knows the 4 countries to the extent that we dug into all of them. No individual person knows that. And yet, you know, when you would hear what people would read, would say about it, or critics would write about it, there's this sort of assumption that they are some kind of an expert in this subject matter. And it's extremely, it's like a very bizarre and strange and perverted nest of connections, connectivities, age-old ideas, and then how they express in all these different ways. And so I'm always surprised at how many people think they understand anti-Semitism, much like I'm always surprised at how many white people think they understand racism. Some of the most vocal critics of this film, whether in the newspaper or just to my face, were people who are not Jewish, or are not openly anti-Semitic. Although some have fallen, by the way, it's interesting, some of the criticisms of the film, for example, one writer wrote, the film is narrated by Juliana Margulies, who is Jewish, which I found to be a baffling way to open it. It's the opening sentence or second sentence of the article. You know, if I were to say, you know, this film about racism is narrated by, James Earl Jones, who is black. You would just never write something like that. Or in our film, we spent a lot of time talking about how George Soros is the victim of the Hungarian government. The Hungarian government blames George Soros for, in an anti-Semitic way, for bringing immigrants into the country. One critic wrote, the film doesn't discuss what George Soros did to get the target on his back. In other words, there's something that, as a Jew, he must have done to cause people to be anti-Semitic toward him, blaming the victim. And I found that fascinating, how quickly people fall into these anti-Semitic actions based on their own, either their own malice or their own lack of awareness or ignorance. But I think I answered the question. I hope I did, or I talked about something that was close enough.
What do you hope the audience walks away from? Is there a call to action after seeing this film?
No, I would never make a call to action. I wouldn't. First of all, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And in fact, nobody really knows where to begin. I mean, people talk about education. I think education is important. I think that teaching people that Jews are human beings like anyone else with the same interests and that they're just regular people is important. And I think that people understanding what anti-Semitism is and just how pernicious it is and just how big a deal it is important. I often wonder if what we do accomplishes anything. My friends who've made a number of films, they're working on one about torture now, have said, you know, we're the last stop. We're the only ones who are sort of saying this in the media because it doesn't get covered, these social justice issues. If you go and you click through any PBS, HBO, Netflix, or what have you, start looking at documentaries, you'll find a whole bunch of them are about ills of society that are not otherwise being reported or discussed. And so in that regard, I like to think of us as the last sort of ethical backstop in the public discussion about what is wrong with the world. The trouble is that a lot of people who view our films have already have an interest in the material. So the idea is to get people who are not necessarily interested in the material to learn and to be educated. We don't make a call to action because what would I say to a Jew living in France who is a victim of anti-Semitism or who lives among Jews? What do I say to that person? Well, here are your options. You could move to Israel. You could move to America. You could buy a gun. I mean, I wouldn't even know what to say to them. And I wouldn't know what to say to a Jew in Hungary or a non-Jew who wants to stop anti-Semitism coming from the government. Or in this country, what do we do to stop the far right? A lot of people have an idea to stop the far right. It doesn't seem to be working so well. And there are a lot of people working in that space. I know many of them. We count our successes in very small increments, and sometimes we take a lot of steps backward. But I'm not an activist. I mean, even the sentence I just used sounded activistic. I'm not an activist. I'm a reporter. I give you the information because I believe that a well-informed populace is the best first step. And at this point, I think we don't have a well-informed populace. You look at huge numbers of Americans, I don't have the data offhand, who don't know what the Holocaust was. Others who don't believe it happened. Others who believe that Jews are a third of this country. I mean, this is bizarre information. The idea that someone doesn't even know what the Holocaust or Auschwitz, maybe it was they didn't know what Auschwitz was. I can't even imagine that's where we are at. So education important. Education working, not sure. I think it's better we have it than we don't. But where do you go from there?
I think every study that has been published around the world in recent memory has shown that Holocaust knowledge has just completely dwindled with every generation. And even past generations are not as well informed as they need to be in order to understand what has happened.
But at the same time, think about what I know about what my kids, like, what do I know about the First World War? My father was born in 1929, so people had finished that war just 12 years before. What does my dad know about the Civil War? There's a cat behind you, by the way, in your yard, or a weasel. But anyway, and so what will my kids know about the Holocaust? My kids will never meet a Holocaust survivor. If they do, it'll be, my son is, very young. He won't remember it. And so that becomes something in the textbooks. I remember how sort of shocked I was. I went to college a few years later than other kids did, other students did. And I remember they taught a class called the 60s. Now, I grew up in the 70s. I think I was about 4 years older, 2 to 4 years older than the students that I was in college with. And I'd also been a little more of a 60s kind of guy before I went to college, and more so than the students at Northwestern, I think, who were not. I'll let you all interpret what you mean. So the 60s to me, and my mother was a very sort of, she wasn't a hippie, but she was hippie-esque. And the 60s, while I didn't live through them, I was born in 68, were something that I had a lot of familiarity with. And I watched all these freshmen, and I think I was a senior at the time, I watched all these freshmen signing up for a class called the 60s. And I thought, how pathetic that you're going to read about the 60s. It just seemed so strange to me. It'd be like if my son signed up for a class called the 80s or the 90s. I wouldn't even, I would just be like, he's studying the 80s? What's he studying? Madonna? And so like, the social movement that was Madonna began in 1984. I can just imagine it. But these powerful historical events are just ideas to the next generation. So, what do you do with that? What do you do with that? I interviewed Elie Wiesel twice. I wouldn't say I knew him, but I knew him-ish. And he'll just be some long gone person by the time my kids are grown up. And that's terrible. He's such a relevant voice for Jews and for the Holocaust. He was the most high-profile person on that conversation. Where does that go? So.
Well, education plays a huge role in this, and I think we all have a responsibility to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have access to the content and films like this are going to play a role in making sure that the information share is out there and helpful and necessary, and gets to audiences who hopefully need to see it. And I agree with you. People who want to see this are going to look at it, and those who don't may not turn an eye towards it, at least the way we hope they will, but we'll see what comes of it. What's next for you?
Well, I'm working on 2 reality shows. I need a break, but I'm also in development on 2 documentaries, and I don't have a lot of money left, but I'm trying to finish a film on animal cruelty, which I think is another miserable thing that we do, is we harm animals all the time without realizing it. And I think that's another important film that needs to be made. But, you know, that's a film that I don't know who's going to want to watch it. I mean, animal cruelty is not something anybody says, you know, hey, honey, let's stay home tonight and watch. We can either watch The Kardashians, or if we're, you know, or we can watch, you know, Downton Abbey, or we can watch this film about mistreating bears and cats. I think it's going to be a pass, and that the people who do watch it will be preaching to the choir. But maybe we can get a few people, change a few minds by educating them about what they think, and we'll go from there.
So as we come to a close, we like to end these interviews with asking our interviewee to share a hopeful note about what you see for the future as the world reopens. What would you like to share with our audience?
A hopeful note, you mean about coronavirus?
A hopeful note about this moment.
Listen, you know, this is a very, I think is deracinated the word. You know, we all feel like we're in a sense of limbo, and I am hopeful that it will normalize for my kids. You know, I'm 52. Well, I'm not 52 yet. I'll be 52 in June, in a month. I guess it's May now. But and sorry for time stamping this, because in this business we don't ever say the date unless it's news. But I'm hopeful that, and I believe, I'm optimistic about this, that my kids will get to see friends again, and, you know, play in their little league and go to their karate classes. I'm hopeful. I'm never going to be your most optimistic participant. It's a curse that has plagued me my whole life. It comes directly from my parents, who are pessimists. My father was a psychoanalyst, and I think that he was exposed to the worst in people for so long. I'm just speaking out of turn, but let's remain hopeful. You know, I see the future. Chin up, onward.
So Andrew, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. I want to thank you again for joining me and offering a glimpse into your film to our online audience. Thank you for joining us, and please tune in to PBS on May 26th to watch Viral, Antisemitism and Four Mutations. Please also be sure to visit Gold Coast Arts for more information and to stay connected to our programs and our offerings. On behalf
One thing is, it's May 26th at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, but check local listings. Some stations wiggle it around.
Excellent. And we'll make sure that we find the right listings for our audience, and we will share that with all of you. Andrew, thank you again for joining us, and thank you all for participating.